In motor racing, some drivers have reputations that precede their results. Whether it's Alain Prost, who is forgotten by a large portion of the F1 fanbase, despite having the measure of every teammate he ever had, including Ayrton Senna, or lesser-known names like Pastor Maldonado, who is known as a crash-prone idiot despite having a great ability to perform in uncompetitive machinery. Modern Formula 1 grids are as close as they've ever been, both in terms of the gaps between the best and worst cars and the best and worst drivers. In this cutthroat environment, there are bound to be a handful of competitors who make up the numbers in most races, and thus get labelled as slow or bad simply because they aren't a world-beating phenomenon. In the past few seasons, the main culprit of discontent amongst fans has been none other than Lance Stroll, for a variety of reasons, including the circumstances in which he got to F1, his perceived underperformance in the sport, and his attitude towards the media often coming off as disinterested. However, I personally believe that Stroll gets an unfair stick from fans and experts alike, and that his reputation as a useless pay driver, and many people labelling him as the worst driver on the current grid, are greatly exaggerated. Without further ado, let's get into this video and discuss the career of Lance Stroll, F1's most underrated driver. Lance Strollovich was born on the 29th of October 1998 in Montreal, Canada, to his businessman father Lawrence and fashion designer mother Claire Anne, who hailed from Belgium. Thanks to his dad's extreme wealth accrued in the fashion industry, Stroll got a leg up in the expensive world of motorsport when he began karting aged 10. He won 7 regional and national Canadian titles in 3 years and became one of the first few drivers inducted into the Ferrari Driver Academy. He remained in karts until 2013 before stepping up to single-seater machinery soon after, participating in the Florida Winter Series and Italian F4, winning the latter championship emphatically despite missing a round due to injury. Stroll claimed the Toyota Racing Series crown in the off-season heading into 2015 and competed in European F3 during the regular calendar year, where he finished 5th in the standings, ahead of future F1 prospects George Russell, Alex Albon and Callum Ilott. He also competed in the Macau Grand Prix, while after 5 years he left the Ferrari stable to take on a testing role with the Williams F1 team alongside his second season in European Formula 3 in 2016. Before the campaign proper, he won the 24 Hours of Daytona in a Ford and took the crown in his main series in dominant fashion. Despite his blistering form, there were allegations of foul play amongst the ranks of the Prema team, which his father had bought prior to his first season in F3, where team orders were deployed for Stroll's teammate Nick Cassidy to give the Canadian driver better results. Alongside that, they had brought on ex-Ferrari man Luca Baldisseri, who had been part of the early 2000s Maranello Dream Team, to be his race engineer, and his new employers at Williams also developed bespoke custom car parts to help his junior series efforts. After his latest title, Stroll was signed by Williams to a full-time F1 seat alongside veteran Felipe Massa after Valtteri Bottas left the Grove outfit to replace the retiring reigning champion Nico Rosberg. He became the second youngest driver in history behind only Max Verstappen and made his debut at the 2017 Australian Grand Prix, but unfortunately crashed during practice, which forced him to change his gearbox and incur a grid penalty. He started last, but made up 6 places on the opening lap and was running 13th when he retired with brake problems. He greatly improved his qualifying form at the second round in China, making it into Q3 for the first time and starting 10th, but he was taken out by Sergio Perez on lap 1. Then in Bahrain, had handling issues that limited him to 12th on the grid, before yet again being wiped out of contention, this time by Carlos Sainz in the race. He finally finished the race, taking 11th in Sochi for the Russian Grand Prix after spinning on the first lap, then had a forgettable run to 16th and last in Spain. Oil pressure problems curtailed his running late on in his first trip to Monaco, then at his home race in Canada, he recovered from a lowly grid position to score his first points in Formula 1 in 9th place. Stroll out-qualified Massa for the first time yet at the Baku street circuit in Azerbaijan and avoided the early chaos, so that by the time that a red flag was brought out on lap 22 to clear debris from earlier incidents, he had worked his way into the top 3. After the resumption of running, he was comfortably in 4th place, but when Hamilton dropped out of contention due to a loose headrest, and Vettel served a penalty for swerving into the Mercedes driver under safety car conditions, Ricciardo assumed the lead of the race with Stroll second, comfortably clear of Magnussen's Haas that led the chasing pack. Unfortunately for the young Canadian, the other Silver Arrows of Bottas assumed 3rd place on lap 43 and closed on him at a rate of knots to challenge him on the final tour. On the 2 kilometre run to the finish line, the Finnish driver edged ahead by only 1/10 of a second. Nonetheless, this was a fantastic result for Stroll and his team, who had lost out on a potential double rostrum as Massa had to retire shortly after the red flag due to suspension issues while in front of his teammate. He became the second youngest podium finisher in F1 history, only 12 days older than Verstappen when he took his victory on Spanish soil in 2016 in a much more competitive Red Bull. After his maiden top 3 finish, he followed his teammate home to 10th in Spielberg, his third consecutive points paying race in a row, then a late pit stop during the British Grand Prix limited him to 16th. Hungary saw Massa replaced by Williams reserve driver Paul Di Resta due to illness during the practice sessions, and while the Scot retired, Stroll drove to an anonymous 14th. He narrowly missed out on points in his second home race, in Spa, then in Monza shocked everyone by qualifying 4th in the soaking wet conditions. As the 2 Red Bulls of Verstappen and Ricciardo received grid penalties for engine components, Stroll lined up on the front row alongside Lewis Hamilton and after a conservative start, fell back slightly. He battled with Raikkonen and Ocon in the middle of the race for a decent points position and eventually came home 7th, just ahead of Massa. The car was uncompetitive in Singapore as both Williams went out in Q1, but in a wet race that saw 6 drivers crash out, including both Ferraris and Verstappen at the start, the Canadian showed yet more speed by finishing in 8th while his teammate failed to score. Stroll was 30 seconds clear of his veteran counterpart before a late safety car bunched up the field after Felipe chose to stay out on full wet tyres instead of intermediates after the second cautionary period on lap 12. He had the upper hand over Massa yet again at the final ever Malaysian Grand Prix as the pair were line astern in 8th and 9th and was running well early on in Japan but dropped out with suspension problems. The 2-stop strategy failed to work at the Circuit of the Americas and thus Lance was down in 11th, but in Mexico he ran as high as 4th before eventually settling for a top 6, 40 seconds clear of his teammate. His rookie season ended on a damp squib with 2 last place finishes as Brazil saw his race ruined by a tyre delamination late on, and Abu Dhabi, where he labelled his car as undrivable, pitting twice in the last half of the final round of the year due to his issues. Stroll's debut campaign for me is an underrated one. In the race as both Williams drivers finished without issue, he matched Massa 4-4 in the race battle, even despite an average qualifying deficit of over 0.6 of a second. Alongside his podium in Baku, he achieved 8 points finishes in 12 weekends unaffected by problems outside of his control, and especially in changeable conditions and chaotic races, proved his worth by staying mostly out of trouble after his early season clashes with Perez and Sainz, neither of which were his fault. Some people might brush off his record against Massa as unimpressive because the Brazilian was in his final F1 season, but in reality, he was still just as good as his other years at the Grove team, consistently scoring points. While it was clear that Lance had a high performance ceiling, there was a clear inconsistency in his results, as he could string together a few good weekends in a row before struggling in the following race or two, only to repeat the cycle. Especially towards the conclusion of the year, it was clear he'd improved, and overall I'd say it was a good rookie year that goes under the radar in the eyes of many fans. For 2018, Massa retired, and thus Stroll was partnered by rookie Sergei Sirotkin, who'd been a staple of the Junior Series and had tested Formula 1 cars with Sauber and Renault as early as 2013 before joining the grid full-time. At the opening round of his sophomore season, it was clear that the car was nowhere near as competitive as the year prior, as although Lance got into Q2 in Melbourne, he finished second to last even despite a mid-race safety car that bunched the pack back up. He qualified last after a scruffy lap in Bahrain, then Sirotkin followed him home to an anonymous finish in the race, and it was a similar story in China. On his return to the Baku circuit, while his rookie teammate hit Perez on the opening lap and got squeezed by Nico Hülkenberg into Fernando Alonso, forcing him into retirement, Stroll brought home the team's first points of the year in 8th, staying away from trouble when others were unable to do so. Although he avoided problems in Azerbaijan, he came together with Max Verstappen while being lapped in Spain as the Dutchman misread the timing of a virtual safety car ending, and Lance eventually finished 11th, nearly a full lap clear of his teammate who struggled all race. An abysmal event in Monaco saw him get a puncture early on due to his wheel rims overheating, then he crashed with Brendan Hartley on lap 1 at his home race in Canada. Stroll was running ahead of Sirotkin in France when he retired due to a puncture, then had the measure of the Russian in Austria on his way to 13th, although he was later penalised 10 seconds for ignoring blue flags. He spun out of the first qualifying session in Silverstone, but after starting from the pit lane along with his teammate and Hartley, recovered to a decent 12th place, 10 seconds clear of Sergei. Brake failure scuppered the Canadian's chances in Hockenheim, then a failed alternate strategy left him behind his teammate a mediocre 17th for the Hungarian Grand Prix. He struggled again to 13th in Belgium, but at the Monza circuit, the Williams saw an upturn in form, and for the only time all year, they scored a double points finish, with Lance 9th and Sergey 10th. Then in Singapore, Stroll was 14th, while Ciaron tangled with Perez and limped home to last. Yet more anonymous races in Sochi and Suzuka followed. Then a first lap collision with Alonso put the younger Williams driver out of contention before he beat his teammate yet again in Mexico with 12th. A late pit stop limited him to 18th in Brazil, and at the season finale in Abu Dhabi, Stroll finished 13th. His sophomore season was far less competitive than his first, albeit through no fault of his own, as the Williams team had transformed from a solid midfielder to the slowest car on the grid across the year. Ciaron was a match for him on Saturdays, but in optimised race trim, Lance had a 9-1 advantage. When the car was as bad as it was, it's hard to know exactly how he performed, but his confident drives to rare points in Baku and Monza, as well as close shaves elsewhere, proved that it wasn't all terrible. Furthermore, although his teammate was a rookie who would never race an F1 beyond the 2018 season, Sergey was by no means a bad driver. He was definitely better than most or all of the backmarker rejects who would come and go in the years following. Lance was quietly becoming a reliable pair of hands, as although his qualifying form was mediocre at best, he made up for it on most Sundays, rarely getting into trouble and often capitalising when others couldn't. Heading into 2019, Stroll left Williams to join the newly rebranded Racing Point team, the outfit formerly known as Force India, before his dad bought it to save it from going bust. This move caused a lot of controversy, as not only did some see Lawrence buying an entire team to guarantee his son a seat on the grid to be egregious, but it also forced Esteban Ocon out of a seat, despite him matching up well against Sergio Perez in his 2-season stint with them as teammates. Ocon would return to the grid in 2020 with Renault and has forged out a good career since then, but people were still mad at this. Now, as much as I've praised Lance so far, it was clear that even if not by a gaping chasm, Ocon was clearly the better driver of the two, and had even been mooted for a drive with the Mercedes Works team before it was pushed off the table, as the Brackley operation didn't want someone to challenge their lead driver Lewis Hamilton, and his teammate at the time Valtteri Bottas was doing a reasonable enough job to consolidate their constructors' position each year. Nonetheless, with the French driver out of a seat and the French-speaking Canadian in, Stroll made his debut for Racing Point alongside Perez, the king of the midfield, as a great benchmark. He started off well in Melbourne by claiming 9th place, over 40 seconds clear of his teammate who failed to manage his tyres as well as others in the same strategy as him. Then in Bahrain was caught up in a racing incident with Romain Grosjean on lap 1, which left him 14th. The two-stopper failed to work in his favour at the Chinese Grand Prix, but Stroll returned to the top 10 at his best career track in Baku, albeit having crashed during practice, and in the race, he finished behind Perez as he struggled to match the Mexican's pace after he lost time with a slow stop. In Catalonia, he was right there with Sergio on track when Lando Norris crashed into him, sending them both into retirement. He was running ahead of his teammate in Monaco when the safety car was brought out for Charles Leclerc, but his engineers didn't pit him, and thus he lost all his track position when he eventually made his pit stop. The Canadian took his 3rd points finish of the year at his home track in Montreal with yet another 9th place, ahead of Perez comfortably after he'd failed to capitalise on yet another alternate strategy, then came up just behind Sergio in Paul Ricard and Spielberg. He was anonymous in Silverstone, beating Checo, who ruined his race by crashing into his former teammate Hülkenberg. Then, while Perez spun off on the first lap of the chaotic German Grand Prix, Stroll briefly led the race after the mid-race safety car and ended up finishing 4th after choosing dry tyres in the final stint of the race in changeable conditions. Vettel and Kvyat on fresher tyres had overtook him, but nonetheless, he avoided calamity in yet another crazy race and claimed his team's best finish of the year up to that point. Antonio Giovinazzi impeded Lance during qualifying in Hungary and he struggled in the race, finishing behind Sergio albeit with an extra pit stop. On the same weekend as Antoine Hubert's fatal accident in the Formula 2 race in Belgium, Stroll took new power unit components which dropped him from 13th to 16th on the grid. He was caught in a sandwich between Ricciardo and Pierre Gasly at La Source on the first lap, and yet another two-stop failed to work out for him, despite rescuing a point for 10th place. Lance was running 7th in Monza when he had to take avoiding action of a spun Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel, who re-entered the track dangerously, thus pushing the Canadian into his own pirouette. Unfortunately, the Racing Points driver came back on track in the same manner as the German, and thus received a drive-through penalty from which he would never recover, despite still being line astern with Perez after losing a quarter of a minute from his escapade. Stroll was running decently well in Singapore until he clouted the wall on lap 41 in the final sector, leaving him out of contention with a puncture. Then he had a forgettable drive to 11th in Sochi before claiming his 4th and 9th place of the year in Suzuka, right behind Checo. He struggled in Mexico on flat-spotted tyres in the final stint, then couldn't make the two-stop strategy work in Austin as his pit stops were offset by 5 laps to anyone else on the same plan as his. He was right behind Perez when he retired from the Brazilian Grand Prix with suspension problems. Then he caused a collision with Daniel Kvyat on the opening lap in the final round in Abu Dhabi before dropping out with unrelated brake issues. His 2019 season, like his rookie campaign 2 years earlier, went under the radar. Going up against his toughest teammate yet, the 7-3 loss in the advanced head-to-head isn't as bad as it seems, as the average gap between Sergio and Lance in the races they both finished without issue on equal terms was only 5 seconds. His qualifying form improved too, as his delta to Checo was only 0.2 seconds per race. It was also Stroll who achieved Racing Point's best result of the year in Germany, and he was often the one who lost out the most due to factors outside his control. Heading into 2020, it was clear that while he was obviously not as consistent as Perez, his overall pace could match or beat him, especially in chaotic situations or changeable conditions. Maybe then, some of the capitalising on chaos rubbed off on both Racing Point and its driver lineup, because it was the Pink Panthers, as they were commonly dubbed, who put together a great year in 2020. The season was supposed to start in Melbourne in March, but due to the disease that cannot be named, it took until July to properly get the campaign going with the Austrian Grand Prix. Unfortunately for Stroll, engine failure curtailed his run in the first round, but in the second race held at the Red Bull Ring, he dunked 2 seconds on his teammate in a treacherously wet qualifying session and came home in the race in P7, beating Perez at the line when the Mexican sustained damage from hitting Alex Albon in the dying laps. Then in Hungary, Lance qualified P3, and while Sergio struggled to 7th, it was the younger driver who took 4th place, half a minute clear. When Perez contracted a disease that shall not be named, Nico Hülkenberg took his place. Stroll had an anonymous run to 9th in Silverstone, while his super sub teammates didn't even start. Another 70th anniversary Grand Prix, running it back for a second consecutive round at the home of British Formula 1, he finished 6th, 1 place clear of Hülkenberg. Perez returned in time for Spain, and in a similar vein to 2019, Stroll was put on an alternative strategy while running ahead of his teammate, only to end up behind him at the checkered flag. Lance led Checo home at the back end of the points in Spa, then achieved a podium in Monza thanks to a red flag that allowed him to change tyres without any time loss. Given the performance of the cars that weren't affected by human-made or mechanical problems that day, he probably should have won. Nonetheless, Stroll was on course to make up for his lack of pace at the Temple of Speed at the Tuscan Grand Prix at Mugello, as he was running 4th, comfortably clear of Perez, when his tyre got a puncture at high speed coming through the second Arrabbiata corner, pitching his car into a violent spin and into the wall to retire. His bad luck continued in Sochi when he was crashed into on the opening lap by Charles Leclerc, sending him into a retirement for the second race running. Lance contracted the evil disease before the Eiffel Grand Prix held at the Nürburgring, but returned for the next round in Portugal. It was a poor comeback weekend though, as he collided with Max Verstappen in free practice 2 at the first turn, then replicated that same move on Norris on Sunday, which took him out of proceedings. He qualified low down in Imola and was caught up in yet another lap 1 incident with Esteban Ocon, this time more a racing incident. Ever since his retirement in Mugello, his results had collapsed, going from scoring in 7 of the first 8 races to none in the previous 5. He needed a good qualifying to get himself back on track, and that's exactly what he did, by putting his car on pole position for the Turkish Grand Prix in the pouring rain on the least grippy track surface in modern F1 history. The resurfacing work done in preparation for the track's first race in 9 years made the tarmac extremely slippery, and Lance was the driver who made the best of the bad situation as others couldn't keep their cars in check. After he qualified first, many thought that just like many other surprise pole positions throughout history, that he would quickly drop back and be a non-factor, but instead, in the first 18 laps, he pulled a 10-second gap on Perez, who had assumed the runners-up position behind, even despite the whole field changing from full wets to intermediate tyres during that time. Soon after though, the trailing Racing Point began catching the lead car, and by lap 35, the degradation on the Canadian driver's tyres, which was far more pronounced than anyone else, had become too much, so the team pitted him for a new set of inters, against his wishes. Unfortunately for Stroll, the fresh rubber made his situation worse, and he was lapping multiple seconds per lap slower than everyone else on old tyres. After plummeting down the pack, he eventually finished 9th, losing over a minute to eventual winner Lewis Hamilton in only 20 laps. After the race, Racing Point did some analysis to find out why Stroll's degradation was so high, and they found that a streak of bodywork from the front wing had fallen off, killing the downforce producing capabilities of his car, thus greatly increasing its load on the tyres and causing the extreme wear. Lance had lost out on a certain win due to a factor completely outside of his control, yet another result he was unable to take, and his problems continued in Bahrain when he was wiped out early on by Kvyat. Luckily for Stroll, he seemed to finally have some luck as F1 stayed in Sakhir to drive the short layout of the same circuit, as following a late safety car, he was sat in 3rd, a podium position with 1st place so close to his grasp. Unluckily for Stroll, both of the drivers in front of him were on better tyres, and one of them was his own teammate, who had undercut him through better strategy. Now don't get me wrong, the story of Perez going from last place to first place to save his future in Formula 1 was utterly fantastic, but had he not been given the better pit calls, he wouldn't have had it so easily. From the end of a safety car on lap 6 until Stroll's first stop on number 42, Sergio gained only 2 seconds, and by the time the next cautionary period came, he had jumped Lance by 3 seconds. The field was bunched together again, but Perez was on newer tyres with better longevity than his teammate in third and Ocon in second, so he pulled out nearly half a second per lap on the shortest track in F1 history. Again, just to reiterate, I'm not trying to say Checo didn't deserve a win at all, just that some factors played into his hands. Lance still achieved a podium in the penultimate round of the year, but ended the season with a lowly 10th place in Abu Dhabi. 2020 was a breakout season of sorts for Stroll, and in my opinion it goes completely under the radar just like some of his other ones. He matched or beat Perez in every race until he caught the plague, then had a small slump before driving a superb race in Istanbul, only to lose it through no fault of his own, and rounded off the season with yet another early DNF, a good performance overshadowed by other events, and a plain average finale. He failed to finish 5 times outside of his control compared to Perez's 4, but lost a lot more points than him due to the Racing Point's fluctuating performances throughout the year. Sergio failed to beat Lance outright in any race they both finished without issue or vastly different strategy, whereas Lance did so to him 5 times. Given that most people laud this campaign as Perez's best and his peak, it's a shame that not many others are willing to offer the same plaudits to Stroll, probably because it takes time and effort to look past the driver's standings results and into the deep detail as to why these things happened the way they did. Also, it would be remiss of me not to mention that the reason why Checo was driving for his F1 career when he won in Sakhir was because Lance's dad had signed former 4-time champion Sebastian Vettel to a deal before the 2020 season had even started. Had he waited for the campaign to get underway, he may have realised that the Mexican was arguably the better option, having inarguably put together a better year than Seb, even in spite of the German's great technical feedback and experience that he would bring. Over the winter break, Racing Point rebranded to become Aston Martin Formula 1 team, and now, after matching up well against the king of the midfield and a wannabe champion, Stroll would have an actual champion to go up against. It was obvious that 2021 Sebastian Vettel wouldn't be on the same level as his prime, but he was looking to recapture his form from the best parts of the previous decade. At the season opener in Bahrain, whilst Stroll reached Q3 and qualified 10th, Aston Martin's new recruit was hampered by yellow flags brought out by Nikita Mazepin's spin in the first session, and thus was down 18th on the grid, falling to last when he was dropped 5 places for failing to respect the warnings displayed. Seb recovered well and at one point was briefly ahead of Lance, but his tyre management was poor, and while the Canadian finished 10th, his teammate was 40 seconds adrift. It was Stroll again who got the upper hand in qualifying in Imola, and he drove through brake cooling and gear sync issues before and during the race, finishing an exemplary 7th on track before receiving a time penalty for overtaking Pierre Gasly off track. Vettel was quite far behind him all day and dropped out in the dying laps with gearbox trouble of his own. Lance struggled on Saturday in Portimao, but made up for it in the main event, following his 4-time champion teammate home by less than a second, while performing the overcut strategy, albeit only to 13th and 14th places. He had the upper hand over Seb in Catalonia, but narrowly missed out on points. Then both got top 10s in Monaco as Vettel was 5th, with the other Aston recovering from a poor qualifying to 8th for the checkered flag. Despite his good record there, Baku was a disastrous weekend for the Canadian Aston driver, as he crashed out of Q1 and started on the back row. During the race, he slowly made his way back through the pack, all the way to 4th place, albeit not having yet made a pit stop, before a tyre failure sent him violently spinning into the wall on the long main straight and put him out. At the next round in Paul Ricard, he was prevented from setting a representative time in the first segment of qualifying due to a crash from Mick Schumacher, and thus began from 19th on the grid for the second race running. Despite this, he made enough overtakes to end up right behind Vettel before their only pit stops of the day, and by the end was only 12 seconds behind him. Styria saw Stroll take 8th, while his teammate was 12th. Then at the next round, also held at the Red Bull Ring, the Astons were far less competitive, but Lance struggled compared to Seb, who was ahead until a late collision forced him into retirement. Vettel spun early on in Silverstone, before eventually dropping out with overheating, while his teammate scored yet another 8th place. Then Stroll crashed into Charles Leclerc on the first lap in wet conditions in Hungary, in a race he could have easily got a good result in. Belgium saw the Canadian in his second home race start yet again on the back row, this time due to a penalty carried over from the previous race, but he was unable to improve his position as the race was suspended after only 1 lap and was never resumed. He also received an additional 10 seconds added on to his race time due to his mechanics changing his rear wing during the red flag. A relatively quiet weekend in Zandvoort had Lance finish ahead of Seb, albeit with both outside the points. Then in Monza, he again was in front in 7th, 5 places clear of his teammate. Aside from a comical moment in the Russian Grand Prix on the radio, where Stroll believed he could stay out on dry tyres as rain came late on, only to helplessly slide off the track into the barrier before rejoining the circuit and spinning off Pierre Gasly, he yet again beat Vettel. Seb tried the opposite strategy in Istanbul, switching to slicks on a drying track midway through the race while running behind Lance, but it didn't pay off, so he finished last while his teammate scored 9th. Stroll's 4-race finishing streak as the lead Aston driver ended in COTA as he struggled to 12th. Then at the Mexican Grand Prix he crashed in qualifying and was unable to make the alternate 2-stop strategy work, eventually completing more laps on his final stint on the mediums than on his second one on the hards. He was taken out by Yuki Tsunoda in Brazil as damage from the AlphaTauri's overambitious dive bomb forced him into early retirement. Then in Qatar took an impressive 6th while Seb was 10th. Lance finished 11th in a chaotic Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, while Seb got caught up in 2 separate racing incidents with Tsunoda and Kimi Raikkonen, retiring from the ensuing damage. Then at the controversial season finale in Abu Dhabi, since Stroll wasn't one of the cars between Hamilton and Verstappen under the safety car at the end, and Vettel was, the German finished in front. Over the course of 2021, it was the Canadian who won the advanced race head-to-head, with 8 races in front compared to Seb's 5, yet despite outperforming yet another teammate across the course of the year, the points standings failed to show that. His qualifying form was also more impressive than usual as he stacked up on Saturdays against Seb, just as well as he had done against Sirotkin or Perez. This was a very underrated year from Stroll in my opinion, and I understand I've said that for the last couple of seasons now, because although he lost his trademark ability to capitalise in the most chaotic weekends, like in Hungary, Spa or Jeddah, on the less crazy ones, he was still able to deliver. The following season saw the introduction of ground effect car regulations, and Vettel remained Stroll's full-time teammate, although he would miss the first 2 races in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia due to contracting the unnameable disease. In the first of those 2 rounds, Nico Hülkenberg, who stood in for his fellow German, outqualified Lance but finished behind a Canadian who achieved 12th place. He was ahead of Nico when Alex Albon hit his Aston Martin into a spin late on in Jeddah, then Vettel returned for the Australian Grand Prix. During the Saturday session used to determine the grid, Stroll and Nicholas Latifi collided, bringing out a red flag. Latifi slowed down to let Lance by when he was on a flying lap, but he had already abandoned his attempt to go quicker in qualifying due to other traffic bunching up around the Williams. Stroll overtook him on the approach to turn 5 nonetheless, then, heading into 6, tried to pull off the racing line to get out of the way of anyone else who was on a fast lap. Unfortunately for both drivers, at the same time that Lance checked his left-hand mirror and pulled to the inside of the circuit, Nicholas tried to overtake him on the inside and thus they collided. The F1 TV commentators were very critical of Stroll at the time, and he received a grid penalty ahead of the race, but I believe this was 50-50. Both drivers could have taken action to avoid, as Lance should have known to check both mirrors before pulling to the inside, while his fellow Canadian should have stayed in position rather than unnecessarily re-overtaking him after already having been passed. Stroll finished 12th in the race, even after getting a needless separate penalty for weaving on a straight, then was unable to set a representative time in Q2 in Imola due to a poorly timed red flag. He scored his first point of the season on Sunday in 10th, then after starting from the pit lane in Miami along with Vettel due to a technical infringement, repeated that result despite being forced off track by Kevin Magnussen on a late safety car restart. He was running right behind Seb in Spain before the team put him on a free-stop strategy that didn't work. Then in Monaco, despite going off numerous times in wet conditions early on, he only finished 7 seconds behind his teammate. Lance crashed in qualifying for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix for the 2nd year running, then retired late on in the race due to vibrations, before taking his 3rd 10th place finish of the year at his home race in Montreal. 11th in Silverstone was followed by 13th in both the sprint and main race in Spielberg, and yet another 10th place in Paul Ricard. He was hit on the first lap by Albon in Hungary and was spun by Ricciardo later on, yet he was still in front of Seb until a strategy blunder put him on used soft tyres, even though Vettel pitted at the exact same time onto new mediums. This saw Stroll finish behind him in 11th, then he got the same place after a poor race in Belgium, before having the edge on Seb in the Netherlands, claiming yet another 10th place at the checkered flag. Engine failure put him out in Monza, then he got his best result of the year so far in Singapore when he finished 6th, 2 places clear of Vettel. More poor strategy calls in Suzuka put him behind Seb again, even despite a great start, then he had a good qualifying in Texas. At the start of the race, he was in 3rd place, but was fighting Fernando Alonso for 7th when he misjudged how close the Spaniard was when trying to overtake him and spun himself out of the race by making a late move, while Fernando continued with damage. In Mexico, he was put on the alternate 2-stopper, and although he finished further behind Seb than he was before his first trip to the pits, he wasn't miles behind. Stroll beat Vettel to the final points position in the Brazilian Grand Prix, and at the season finale used a 2-stop yet again, this time to good effect as he overtook Seb late on and finished 8th. Overall, Lance's 2022 campaign was good but not great. While in the previous few years he'd mostly cut out his silly incidents, going off several times in Monaco and getting blamed for the crash with Latifi in Melbourne did damage to his reputation. He lost the advanced race to head-to-head against Vettel 7 races to 6, and the average gap between them was 1.3 seconds at the checkered flag. Stroll had clearly not been as good as he was in either 2020 or 2021, but he was still impressive enough to basically match a 4-time champion after beating him comfortably the previous year. Ahead of the following season, Seb retired from Formula 1 aged only 35, and continuing the trend of hiring former title winners, Alpine's Fernando Alonso, who Stroll had crashed with only 4 races before the 22 campaign was finished, joined the team ahead of 2023. Unfortunately for the Canadian, he fractured both his wrists and broke one of his toes in a February cycling accident, forcing him to get surgery and have metal screws inserted into his hands, and he missed all of pre-season testing. Throughout the first race weekend of the year in Bahrain, he reported that he still had lingering pain from the accident and often felt stiff. From the onboards, it was clear that he was driving some corners differently to avoid using his hands too much, and in qualifying he was half a second away from his new teammate. Alonso ended the race in 3rd, while Stroll nearly took him out on turn 4 in the first lap, but still drove a steady race to 6th, 15 seconds behind. Lance closed the gap on Saturday to 2/10 in Jeddah, then overtook Ocon and Sainz on the opening tour. He ran in 4th until he pitted, then shortly after retired with an engine failure that denied him some healthy points. In Melbourne, when the red flag chaos that transpired at the end of the race happened, Stroll scored that 4th place, only just behind Alonso. He struggled to 7th in Baku, half a minute behind his teammates, and in Miami started 18th despite maintaining the same gap, only recovering to 12th, before he experienced an abysmal race in Monaco, where once the rain hit, he went down the escape road at Mirabeau, reversed out of there, before understeering into the barrier at the hairpin, losing his front wing, before hitting another wall at Portier 1 and retiring just before the tunnel. Spain saw Stroll out-qualify Alonso for the first time, then on Sunday he outpaced him to finish 6th, somewhat making up for his struggles in the previous rounds. This improvement failed to continue in Montreal as a wrong tyre call in drying conditions on Saturday put him 13th on the grid and he only climbed back up to 9th. I've not mentioned any sprint races so far in this video because they often provided no extra information about Lance, but in Austria he took 4th, ahead of Fernando in the shortened distance Saturday event. Then in the Grand Prix proper, he had out-qualified the Spaniard only to be put on a free-stop strategy that put him in the low reaches of the points, through no fault of his own, for the second weekend running. Stroll was only 5 seconds adrift of his teammate at the checkered flag in Silverstone, but was penalised for a collision with Pierre Gasly, despite the French driver needlessly pushing the Aston Martin off track and leaving insufficient room to rejoin, which dropped him down the order. In Hungary and Belgium, he finished behind Alonso due to, you guessed it, another failed strategy, having also crashed in SQ2 in Spa. Then in the wet in Zandvoort, he lost over 50 seconds by not pitting for intermediates when the rain hit early on, despite Lance protesting multiple times to make a pit stop. By the time everything settled down, he was last, and even after the first safety car period, struggled to make overtakes on the difficult-to-pass track. When the red flags came out on lap 64, he was in 13th, and he managed to take 11th after 72 laps, and this was now the 5th race out of the previous 6, where he'd lost out due to factors outside of his control completely. Monza was another write-off as he started last and couldn't recover, with his car performance inexplicably falling off in the closing stages, losing up to 3 seconds per lap at some points. A big crash during qualifying in Singapore prevented him from even starting, and he was on course for points in Suzuka before retiring from an overly flexing rear wing. In the controversial Qatar Grand Prix, after a poor qualifying where he had received condemnation for physically pushing his engineer, another failed alternate strategy and track limits infringements failed to yield any points, and once the race ended, Stroll was one of many drivers who admitted to suffering from severe heat stroke, even admitting to losing consciousness at some points during the latter part of the night. He struggled to even get out of his car in Parc Fermé and went straight to the medical centre after doing so. Lance somewhat resurrected his form after this point and picked up his first points in 5 race weekends in COTA with 7th place after having ran ahead of Alonso during the sprint before he retired. He was ahead of Fernando in Mexico before more trouble took the Spaniard out, while Stroll himself was crashed into by Valtteri Bottas. In seemingly the only race the two Aston drivers had the same strategy, the Canadian took a so far season best 5th place, only 6 seconds behind his teammate in Brazil. Before the inaugural Las Vegas Grand Prix, he went from 14th on the grid to another 5th place at the checkered flag, this time ahead of Alonso, dunking 5 seconds on him despite a mid-race safety car. An anonymous drive to 10th in Abu Dhabi capped off a year of struggle for Lance, and this is arguably the campaign that cemented his reputation in the minds of most F1 fans. It was seen by most people at the time, including myself, that especially at the start of the season, while Alonso was bringing the new and improved second best car to constant podiums and great results, Stroll couldn't get near that level. While it's true that he had a hard time, it certainly wasn't as bad as people thought. Yes, he made a few dumb mistakes. Yes, in some races he was completely nowhere. However, an 11-3 loss in the advanced race head-to-head shows that on occasion he could beat Fernando, and there were several silly strategies that held him back massively, such as losing a whole minute by being forced to stay out on dries in Zandvoort when everyone else was on inters. Furthermore, of the 11 races Alonso fairly beat him in 5 of those he was only 1 or 2 places behind, or within a few seconds, averaging out to only 11 seconds per race, which for example is a smaller gap than the one between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc in 2025 as Ferrari teammates. I'm not going to suggest this is a direct comparison, as current Leclerc is better than 2023 Alonso, even if only slightly, but what I'm trying to say is that while Lance should definitely have done better considering his great performances in the 2020 Racing Point, he wasn't completely devoid of speed and results. Also, it's important to remember that he was facing the effects of his wrist injuries throughout, as they have continued to cause issues for him as recently as the 2025 Spanish Grand Prix, which he had to sit out from entirely. Being unable to catch a slide on a ragged edge of grip, crashing more often and being more inconsistent than usual are definitely traits of a driver that isn't fully up to physical fitness, and I can definitely attest to that as someone with a physical disability who drives go-karts and can turn from prime Schumacher to Narain Karthikeyan in the space of a 15-minute session just getting fatigue. Especially after the Qatar race in the back end of the season, his results drastically improved, and he actually outscored Fernando in those 5 rounds to finish off the year. 2023 was rock bottom, so surely the following campaign would be better. In Bahrain, he didn't start off great, as on the first corner of the first lap of the first race, he was half spun by Nico Hülkenberg, dropping him to the back, and he was put on a different strategy to Alonso from there on in. Nonetheless, he recovered to score a single point, only 1 position behind his teammates despite his early calamities. Stroll crashed out of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix while running in 9th place early on, but out-qualified Fernando in Melbourne before strategy yet again scuppered his chances as he was pitted off of his first set of mediums far too early. He still took 7th, only a place away from his teammate, on track before Alonso was given a very harsh post-race penalty for quote-unquote potentially dangerous driving when George Russell got scared of him braking early for a corner and seemingly forgot how to drive. Lance was put on a free stopper in Suzuka, which lost him a chance of points. Then in China, after an early skirmish with Hülkenberg, the Canadian was involved in an incident at the hairpin. His Aston Martin teammate locked up his brakes as he misjudged the speed of the cars in front of him heading into the corner. This caused everything behind the Spaniard to have a concertina effect, and unfortunately, his teammate was slightly on the throttle at the same time as everyone else around him was braking due to Alonso in front slowing down. Stroll was unable to see the pack bunching up before they all slowed down to a crawl, and thus he hit the back of Ricciardo, giving both drivers damage. It was Lance who was given the penalty, but honestly it should have gone to Alonso. He caused the unnecessary stack-up, and if those behind him weren't quickly trying to stop to avoid him, it wouldn't have caused the car behind, who was out of sync to the rest of the pack, to underestimate how slow they were going. After the penalty, Stroll finished 15th, but he outqualified Fernando in the Miami sprint before both were taken out of contention by an outrageous Lewis Hamilton dive bomb. Then in the main event he was put on a 2-stopper compared to Alonso's 1 and was given a penalty late on for breathing on a white line while overtaking Alex Albon. While his teammate endured arguably the worst weekend of his career at Imola by qualifying and finishing 19th, Lance brought the team home some points, while during the Monaco race he was 15 seconds clear of Alonso when the team brought him in for a needless pit stop and told him to push. He then clipped the wall at the Nouvelle chicane, necessitating another trip to the box, yet he still finished only 2 seconds adrift of the Spaniard. The team finally put him on the same strategy as Fernando in Montreal and he finished 7th, only marginally behind. At the Spanish round in Catalonia, the Canadian had a minor impeding incident with Lewis Hamilton in practice. Then in the race, although he and his teammate were on the same compounds throughout, Lance pitted earlier to start his final stint and thus his tyres fell off towards the end and he lost out. Stroll handed Alonso's rear end to him in both the Austrian sprint and main race, finishing a combined 50 seconds clear as his teammate got caught up in incidents with other drivers. Then in Silverstone and Hungary the order was the same, as the Canadian took 6th and 10th, 1 place clear of the other Aston in both instances. He crashed in a wet Belgian FP3 and qualified badly, unable to recover in the race. In Zandvoort, he stayed close to Fernando's tail despite a pit lane speeding penalty, then a free-stop strategy failed to work in Monza, before in Baku, a first-lap puncture and brake failure ended a miserable afternoon for him. Singapore was a very poor weekend from Lance, while although Texas was less so, he still struggled in the main race after finishing ahead of Alonso in the sprint. Stroll was ahead when his teammate retired in Mexico, but then in Brazil, he arguably had the worst race of his entire career. Well, it wasn't even technically a race, as he locked his rear tyres and spun into the barrier on the formation lap, then while trying to get back on track, drove into a gravel trap. This was completely his own fault, although from his view, he didn't know when he was turning around to get back on the circuit that there was gravel there. Nonetheless, he shouldn't have got off in the first place. Then in Las Vegas, slightly different strategies played out in the Aston garage that put him behind. He got tangled up in an incident with Albon on the first lap in Qatar, which put him out again, before the last stint curse struck Lance once more in the Abu Dhabi finale and he lost out. 2024 was definitely an improvement for Stroll. Especially in the beginning and middle of the season, he was regularly matching or beating Alonso before slightly falling off towards the end. In the Grand Prix or sprints that both drivers finished without factors outside of their control adversely affecting them, it was only 9 races to 8 in Alonso's favour as to who was in front, and on average, Stroll was actually slightly in front in terms of time. This means that while Fernando finished ahead once more than Lance, when he did so, his gaps to the Canadian weren't as big as when the Spaniard was behind him. Going into the summer break, Stroll was actually comfortably clear on the head-to-heads, but only finishing in front once after the Hungarian round swung it out of his hands. While he'd matched up and slightly beaten his teammates despite a point standings deficit of 70 to 24, his end-of-year slump was noticeable, and thus, Lance would have to keep an eye on that heading into 2025. Stroll started off the season well, as he finished in 6th place in the opening round in a wet Melbourne race, while Alonso spun out. Some defended his teammates because there was some gravel on the curb that spat him into the barrier, but at the end of the day, it was still his own mistake and no one else had that problem. The Canadian took 9th place in both the sprint and main event in China, ahead of Alonso in the former and behind him when he retired in the latter. After he qualified last in Suzuka, Aston put Lance on a 2-stopper that failed, so he was the only driver to be lapped. Then in Bahrain, he followed Fernando home only slightly behind at the checkered flag. He was unable to make the alternate strategy work in Jeddah as both cars finished outside the points. Then in the Miami sprint, a good strategy call gained him 11 places and got him a top 5, while Alonso got involved in a needless incident with Liam Lawson. Stroll followed his teammate home on Sunday to 16th, copied that formula to 15th in Imola, albeit more positions adrift. Then poor qualifying in the farcical Monaco Grand Prix limited him to another poor finish, although he was one of the only drivers to make a legitimate on-track overtake all race when he passed Hülkenberg on the final lap. After qualifying for the Spanish round, Stroll withdrew from the rest of the weekend as his wrist was in pain, a residual injury from his cycling accident over 2 years prior. Given that his 2023 and 24 seasons, although not completely horrendous, were still a level below his performances from 2019 to 22, it does make you wonder just how many of his seemingly dumb errors or general inconsistencies were caused by pain that wasn't enough to subside but was enough to be a hindrance to him. After sitting out that race, he returned in Montreal with a bandaged hand, skimmed a wall in FP2, and had a poor qualifying from which he couldn't recover. He was put on a failed 2-stopper yet again in Spielberg, but when changeable conditions came up in the British Grand Prix, Stroll moved up from 17th on the grid to 4th place before the safety car was deployed on lap 14, having made 5 overtakes in the opening 5.9 kilometres before pitting for slicks and passing another 6 cars in just one trip around the circuit. He was running third when Verstappen spun on the restart, but his car's extreme tyre degradation caused him to slowly fall into the lower reaches of the points, eventually dropping to 7th, 2 places ahead of Alonso, who was on better tyres at the end. He kept this form up in both the sprint and main race in Spa, albeit with no points on offer, but the Astons rocketed up the performance charts in Hungary, where they finished 5th and 7th. Stroll had suffered from yet more bad tyre wear, then in Zandvoort crashed in both practice and qualifying, started 19th, but due to a bold strategy had made his way up into the points by just after 1/3's distance, and ended the race in 7th place, unbelievably ahead of Alonso who had started in the top 10. A bad Saturday in Monza left him in the hands of yet another absurd strategy, this one seeing him complete 50 laps on the hard tyres before pitting right at the end to not fall foul of the rules. Another go long and Inshallah tyre decision led him to 17th in Azerbaijan, then 13th in Singapore where he did 38 laps on soft tyres, more than the 23 that he did on mediums. They finally put both cars on the same plan in Kota, which put Lance narrowly behind, while he had crashed into Ocon in the sprint. Then he was right with Fernando when he retired in Mexico. Aston's speed yet again improved in Brazil, and Stroll was 9th with Alonso 6th in yet another sprint, before on Sunday, the Canadian was involved in a clumsy lap 1 incident with Gabriel Bortoleto and was later hit on by Yuki Tsunoda. He still finished only a few seconds away from his teammate. Then in Las Vegas, I think this race pretty much sums up how his season has gone so far. He was very fast in Q1 as the wet tyres were used, then in Q2, while everyone else opted to remain on the blue walled compound, either Lance or the team, most likely the latter, opted to change him onto a set of intermediates. This was baffling because not only were the intermediates not guaranteed to be faster, but no one else had taken the gamble to switch. Surely, even if they predicted that Inters were faster, they would have seen that he was still in the top 5 on the wets, and would have made it through based on previous pace, even if the tyres were slightly unsuited to drying conditions. Not only was he robbed of a good starting position by being on the wrong rubber, but then, as a direct result of a qualifying mistake, he was directly in the path of the intercontinental ballistic missile that was Bortoletto's Sauber at Turn 1, sending him into retirement.
He had an anonymous race in Qatar, but after struggling in qualifying in Abu Dhabi, for once managed to make the alternate strategy work to get into the points to round off the 2025 F1 season. Lance Stroll is on a career renaissance at the moment, and I think is on course to finally match the form he found towards the end of the previous regulation set in 2020 and 2021.
People like to make fun of him because he can make dumb errors. Even I, as someone who often defends him, can see that he has a few flaws, such as struggling in qualifying, especially when the car is particularly uncompetitive, and having those lapses in common sense and judgment more so than other drivers. Nonetheless, I'd say his racecraft, when he doesn't overstep the mark, is actually quite good, probably because for nearly a decade now, he's had to fight uphill battles in races due to poor qualifying, and in low grip conditions like rainy or cold weather, he's easily top 5 drivers on the grid. Many experts comment that he has a very good kinesthetic feel for the limit of grip, and drives more akin to that physical limit than due to any muscle memory built up over years. That does make sense, because his qualifying gaps compared to his teammates improve drastically if the car is good. The perfect example of that being how he went from a quarter of a second behind Sergio Perez in 2019 to marginally faster in 2020, despite both of them having the best seasons of their careers. Now obviously the big outlier to the idea that Lance steps up to the task in fast cars is 2023, but I don't think anyone apart from himself truly knows just how much that pre-season bicycle accident affected him, because surely, if it did enough damage to randomly resurface more than 2 years later, it must have caused him discomfort in more races than just Bahrain that we saw in 23. Bear in mind, towards the back end of that year, he did improve quite a bit after his Singapore crash, and maybe that is the case. Again, this year, Aston Martin have been very up and down from weekend to weekend, and while Alonso has the measure when the car is comfortably capable of points, when it's been a fringe top 10 car, it's often been Stroll capitalising, namely in Australia, the Miami Sprint, Britain, and even Zandvoort, when he went from last to ahead of Fernando. On a normal dry weekend when the car can't do anything, even if Lance wanted to show his speed, the Racing Point or Aston engineers have consistently put him on weird strategies hoping for a magical safety car or red flag to save him. This year's been a prime example of that, and so far in the advanced race head-to-head, he might be losing 9-6 to Alonso. However, in 7 of those 9 he was behind, he was right behind him, either position or time-wise. As well as ignoring fair head-to-head battles in favour of simply regurgitating points standings results from Wikipedia, another factor that people don't consider is the calibre of teammates that he's gone up against. Sure, 2017 Felipe Massa wasn't as good as he was in his prime, but he was still a very good driver and a consistent peddler in that midfield Williams. Sergei Sorokin is forgotten as a one-season wonder nowadays, but as I said earlier, he's definitely better than some of the stinkier rookies we've had between then and 2025, such as Nick de Vries, Nicholas Latifi, Guan Yu Zhou, and guys like that. Sergio Perez was amazing at Racing Point, and Lance was very close to him in 2019 and outperformed him in 2020. Again, some fans are bound to dismiss that statement because they go off vibes and point standings without looking into race-by-race context, but that's their own fault. In 2021, he outclassed Sebastian Vettel, who, just like Massa, might have been past his prime, but it wasn't like he carried on his awful form from his final year at Ferrari. Seb was more competitive in 22 and matched Stroll, but to say you had matched a 4-time champion one year and beat him in the other is definitely a brag, regardless of the circumstances. 2023 was a dark spot on Lance's career though. It got so bad that people thought he was going to quit F1 to play tennis. I don't think he and his father realised just how fast Alonso at 42 years old still was, and the mental side of that, combined with the physical problems we discussed, culminated in a very disappointing season. 2024 though was far better, and it definitely goes under the radar that he went from being comfortably beaten by Fernando to matching him when on equal terms. In the last season of a regulation set that initially curbed his career trajectory, Lance has shown flashes of absolute brilliance this year, especially in races where his teammate embarrassed himself. Heading into 2026, things can only look up for the Canadian. He now has Adrian Newey as a team principal, who should still have a say in car development, and if they are right near the front, don't count Stroll out. The new design concept for next year will make cars lighter with less downforce and more top speed, which means they will be as low grip as they've been at any point during his career. Maybe he was born in the wrong era. Maybe if he'd have debuted during the skinny turbo hybrid era, or the period between the two traction control eras in the mid to late 90s, Lance Stroll could have been a force to be reckoned with. Still, in 2026, his teammate might be a former two-time champion with great longevity, but he's also going to be 45 years old, the oldest driver in F1 since the 70s, and he has to lose his talent eventually. He has to fall off at some point. If that Aston Martin is comfortably the best car, and the regulations do indeed reduce downforce and grip, I can see Stroll pushing Alonso all the way to claim a title. He's definitely not the worst driver on the grid. You can't have the peaks he has while being some undeserving idiot. Lance is one of those drivers, like Pastor Maldonado, or even an older example, like Andrea De Cesaris, who people only recognise when they make mistakes, or say something they don't like. People can remember lots of times where Maldonado crashed on his own, but not the 2 times where he was taken out of great results by Lewis Hamilton, or the race where he won in the 5th best car. Suddenly, when Maldonado won a race, people came up with 50 million conspiracy theories as to why it wasn't legitimate, and I did cover this topic in another video, but it's the same for Stroll. If Aston Martin is good next year, and Stroll wins a lot of races or even a title, just watch how people will say that his dad paid Alonso to make him look good, or that there's sabotage going on. Sabotage is Kimi Raikkonen at Ferrari in 2008, or, to a much lesser extent, McLaren against Alonso the year before, not when a driver that most people don't like dares to perform well. You don't get to pole position, podiums, and great head-to-heads against former champions and multiple-time race winners while being the worst driver on the grid. It's simply not possible. Anyway, I think with that rant concluded about modern racing fans and people who can't judge drivers without judging what they don't like about them, that should bring today's video to a close. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. You can also subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like to see exclusive content, get videos a day early and have an opportunity to converse with me personally for as little as $1 per month. Big shout out to my already existing Patreon subscribers Andy Lamberts, Judo Maida and Elizabeth Hearn, and you can also take a look at the DRS Train Podcast, which I host alongside Peter Brook, Nav F1 and Ciaron Smith, where we take deep dives into historical topics and race reviews after each round of the current F1 season. We also recently did an interview with former race engineer Mark Slade. You should definitely give that a listen. Furthermore, you should go and follow my X/Twitter account where I post boiling hot lava takes on F1, IndyCar and NASCAR, and follow my Instagram for behind the scenes updates. With my shameless plugging over though, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!